welcome to another edition of Team English Talks, and as promised today we will be focusing on the Eduqas Poetry Anthology, particularly those poems that are to do with nature. So, before we tackle the theme of nature, Mr Steele, why do we write and study poetry?
Because poetry is, as I say quite often to my classes, it is painting with words. That's getting across your ideas and crafting an idea into a set of words that sounds pleasant and, you know, makes the reader think about something. I'm going to read a quote from Simon Armitage about poetry, because we love old Simon.
We do.
And he says that one reason that people love poetry is that poetry requires concentration, both on the part of the writer and the reader. But it's kind of unkillable. It's our most ancient art form, and he thinks it's more relevant today than ever because it's one person saying what they truly believe. And I think that's poetry encapsulated there. It really is a chance for us to try and teach the appreciation of language and an understanding on a deeper level of language, and it's I just love it. I love poetry.
There's something quite primitive about it, isn't there? I've got another quote as well. I'll jump in at that point. I've got a quote from one of our poets, actually, from Rita Dove. We won't be talking about her today because she's not got a nature poem in the anthology, but she said poetry is language at its most distilled and most powerful. I agree with you, Mr Steele. I think it's the fastest way to make a connection to somebody that isn't next to you through the written word, because it is directly emotional. It's also powerful, though, because, as she says about language at its most distilled, the interesting thing about poetry is that even though it's the written word or the spoken word, it also incorporates musicality into it. And I think that's why poetry is so powerful, because it takes into account the lyricism that language can have. So poems can have rhythm. Obviously they don't have to, but they can have a rhythm to them, and that brings in the element of language that a lot of people miss about language, is that it does have a musical, lyrical quality to it, and I think that's why it builds such a powerful connection. I think that's why it's unkillable, actually, because it's much more deep-rooted.
It evolves, doesn't it, rather than dying, you know,
Yeah.
and there's people who will still write, you know, Petrarchan sonnets and things like that, you know, but there will be completely abstract forms of poetry as well. They don't have to follow.
Same with slam poetry.
Yeah.
It's got that rhythmic, rap-like, lyrical quality to it, and again, it evolves. Like you say, it can survive across much longer periods of time. So yeah, distilled and powerful.
Right, thank you, Mr Steele and Miss Dale. Sorry, we were so excited about talking about nature, I forgot to even introduce everybody.
Rude.
So, I'm Miss Owens, and today is a special podcast day because we are joined by one of the new members of the English department, Mrs Pearson, who you're very, very welcome, and I'm hoping we'll bring a more sensible... No, did I say sensible? I meant a different sort of edge to the...
If we were talking last week about Fred being the antithesis of Scrooge, then perhaps Mrs Pearson is the antithesis of Mr Bruff. I mean, we all like Mr Bruff, but, you know, perhaps a little bit more sensible and considerably less camp.
Ooh. The gauntlet has been thrown down.
I'd resent that.
Yeah.
So,
just to give you a flavour of what I'm all about, I think poetry is ketchup.
Oh, controversial.
There you go. Not sensible at all. Poetry is ketchup. I agree. It's the most powerful distilled flavour of the written word. Just like tomatoes
Quite
distilled into ketchup. So there you go.
Do you know what? It's almost like, you know, when you get those little sachets of ketchup, and if you want to get all the ketchup out, you've got to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze.
That is poetry.
It is poetry. Poetry
You've
is
got
ketchup.
to squeeze as much out of it as possible to get what you can. There you go. You learn something every day. Thank you, Miss.
Great metaphor to use, considering we're talking about poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I had a quote from Carol Ann Duffy, who we also deal with in the... we read her wonderful poetry at GCSE and A level, and she says poets deal in writing about feelings and trying to find the language and images for intense feelings. And I just think one of the things that we get with poetry that we haven't sort of touched on with Christmas Carol is the fact that it's, well, I expect we did, didn't we? It's read out loud.
Yeah.
We get those wonderful sounds that can leave people laughing or wincing or you know, just sort of
Or
really
crying.
sort of, or crying.
And I think
Yeah.
actually that's an important skill that it's hard to teach, especially when it comes to, I know we're not talking about today, but the unseen poetry section of the exam, because it's a poem that they've never experienced before, and they get in and it's trying to teach them to read it in their head as if they would read it out loud, because it is meant to be heard. And it's about trying to hear it inside your head, isn't it? And
Maybe that's something we take for granted because we're well versed, no pun intended, in the
well stanzard.
Thank you.
Surely you're not going to stanza for that.
Oh, she is Mr. Pro.
Stop the recording
It's
right
like
now.
he's in the room.
Love it. Yeah, maybe we take that for granted a bit because we're so used to approaching reading a poem. Maybe that's something we should start with. Like, how should you even start approaching a poem?
Yeah.
What should you do first? How do you read it? I think that's probably a good starting point, actually.
And I think when we come on to revision, when we come on to sort of top tips, maybe sort of reading the poem out loud to yourself and thinking about things like the rhythm and thinking about which words are stressed and which aren't, and you know, thinking you know, how the tone of voice that you would use it to read in as well. So anyway, we could talk about poems generally forever, and we will do if nobody tells us to shut up.
Yeah.
Yes, but right. So Nature in the Poetry Anthology. Which poems are we dealing with in terms of nature?
Well, we've got. I think we would say, wouldn't we, that there are a core that are quite obviously nature-based, and then there's others that have got natural flavours, shall we say?
Are we sticking with the condiment
with the ketchup theme? Yeah.
So
Maybe they're the mayonnaise, not quite the ketchup.
Ooh. I've got a nice neat list here. I'll go
on
for them. So your core nature poems. So you're looking at Death of a Naturalist, Hawk Roosting, Extract from the Prelude to Autumn.
I would argue that's
Those
the
are your core
yeah.
ones.
Yeah.
But then on the outskirts, you've got Ozymandias, you've got Mamet's Wood, and did we even argue...
As imperceptibly as grief, potentially, as well?
Possibly even
Yeah.
imperceptibly
Well,
as
one
grief,
of my
yeah.
attends was arguing this morning that
Afternoons as well,
cozy
yeah.
apologia
With
it's
the-
got a
It's got the
hurricane,
in it,
yeah.
But
Afternoons, yeah.
yeah, I think best for if we're looking at students sort of revising poetry for nature, I think those four core ones are probably going to be your best one. I mean, do remember that in the exam you know, if you're asked about a poem, a single poem, the poem is written there for you. What you're looking for is remembering quotes and poems that you can compare with that.
And I think that's an interesting point to make there, in that, yes, I would probably agree with one of your students that there is like parts of nature that you could talk about with Cosy Apologia, but if I was presented with the Prelude in my exam and was asked to compare it on nature, Cosy Apologia would not be the first one.
No,
I would
and I think
choose,
that's a point. That's a good point as well. They're probably highly unlikely to pick a poem like that, like Cosy Apologia, and make the topic nature. It seems unlikely.
They want you to succeed.
Yeah, they're gonna go for an obvious one.
Yeah,
Cosy Apologia would be love or relationships, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Don't fall down this trap that other people have before, by thinking if you take a really obscure poem, you're going to get more marks for it. You're absolutely not. Go for the obvious. Go for the ones that work really well, because they're the ones that you're going to have the best response. You're going to be confident with those, and that confidence will shine through. Yeah. So, shall we start off with Death of a Naturalist? I think
Sure, we've all got our anthologies in front of us.
Yeah.
Shush, miss. We have.
You mean you don't know the poem off by heart?
We have. Yeah, we know.
Oh, shout out to my year 10s because they're forcing me to, but they well know that I can recite some of these by heart. But Death of a Naturalist was a new one to me actually this year.
I love this poem. I love the way it changes from
Do you want
that
to jump in on it?
childhood glee through to the angry frogs, and the realisation that nature's not all good. So I love that. I love the Volta in Rain. It just stops and makes you think. I love that one.
I just love that sort of intensely childish flavour that first stanza has got, and how he gets carried away and lost in his childhood self, and it you can imagine yourself talking to a primary school child and them telling you all about their love of frog spawn.
He's picked a
and
good
nature and
memory,
stuff.
hasn't he? I mean, I definitely remember like prattling about with frog spawn every summer as a kid.
Yeah, you go with your little nets
and your
wouldn't you,
buckets and
your
stuff, don't you?
buckets
Yeah.
and go and collect some frog spawn and see what happened. But talking about the sounds of the poem as well, when he talks about, but best of all was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water. And it's just like that slobber, isn't it? It's just such a wonderful word.
And we talk about like unpicking like the depth of those words. Like, it's just like the perfect description of frog spawn, like clotted water.
And that's where you can hear the sounds coming in as well. You have to
Yeah.
say slobber out loud, don't you?
Slobber. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just while we're shouting out, I'm not going to mention him by name, but one of my year 10s intensely enjoys reading out the poem aloud so that he can say the word slobber, because yes, it must just resonate with him a bit more than the other words, I think.
I think this is a lovely poem because, again, from our point of view when we were growing up a long time ago,
For some of us.
for some
Thank
of us
you.
longer than others. For me, my parents lived next door to a lake, so I was always out there with, collecting frog spawn and looking at the tadpoles and things. And it just sort of resonates, that sense of childlike wonder when you get here, like the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mummy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. And the repetition of the there, you get a real sort of childlike enthusiasm. If any of you have younger siblings and they come home from primary school, and we learnt this, and we learnt to paint, and I did this, and I did this, and we get this real sort of enthusiasm that really sort of encapsulates this childlike wonder at nature, because if you do think about it, nature is a wonderful thing. And as a child, you have that innocence, don't you? You go splashing through puddles, you'll throw yourselves down the nearest hill, and you're not bothered whether there's a bit of dog poo at the end of it or whatever it is, because do you know what? You'll just brush yourself down and you'll do it again. And it's us as adults, isn't it, who see the danger. It's us as adults, maybe I won't do that because it might be a bit messy, or won't do that, might be dangerous. And you get that clear sort of sense in Death of a Naturalist.
I just want to touch on something controversial. I don't know whether it's controversial, I don't know what your guys' thoughts on it, but I tend to, with this poem, when we're thinking contextually, talk about how perhaps, because obviously we need to use that word all the time, we have to be tentative with our analysis and things like that, we don't know 100% for sure. Perhaps that loss of innocence, that change in Heaney in that second stanza reflects his almost awakening and in his awareness of what was going on in Northern Ireland in the 60s as he grew up, and that sort of awareness of the Troubles and the IRA and all that militaristic language, perhaps that sort of using that natural metaphor and the frogs as these like invasive, dangerous things.
He mentions the word grenades, doesn't he?
that metaphor for him becoming aware of what was going on around him and that danger. And that reflects that what you were saying about that adulthood coming into it, and the adult being more like, as a child you're just running around loving nature, having a great time, and things are going on around you that you're not aware of, and then there's that change and that sort of growth. And I do teach that, but I always say, we have to be tentative with that. We don't know 100% for definite, but we know about his background and how he grew up and what was going on around.
And if you do want to look into him, if you read more into Heaney and you look at the other, he uses nature. He just loves nature. You can tell he was raised in nature. His poetry, if you're interested in Heaney, if you want to read more poetry, a lot of his poetry is centred in and around nature. He talks about his dad in a similar way and following him around ploughing a field. He talks about
the storm on the
storm,
island.
like all that sort of natural reference. I think he seems sort of, if anybody grew up in the countryside, I did. I can sort of understand it. You just kind of have this kind of primeval almost link, and that's how you look at the world forevermore. So I see what you mean about that growing up, because he does the same in other poems. As he starts to grow up and he gets this different perspective on the world, he still links it to nature, because it's always there, isn't it? It's that universal thing. It kind of follows you around. And I feel like he feels a bit haunted in this poem. So that probably does link to what you were saying, Mr. Steele, definitely.
What I quite like about it is that nature doesn't change, but your perception
Yes, you do,
of nature changes. So we get these sort of, this excitement about the tadpoles and the frogs and everything, and then you get this poised like mud grenades, with the frogs, with the warlike imagery, their blunt heads farting. I just wanted to say the word farting because that's quite fun. I sickened, turned and ran. And this is somebody who's lost that sort of innocence and realises that perhaps the world around them isn't quite so safe, isn't quite as lovely and nice, and nature actually can be quite dangerous. So...
And that's set up as well, isn't it, in the first line of the second stanza? It's still a hot day in the second stanza. The nature hasn't changed, literally.
That's what I always thought. Because when I first read the poem, I was like, oh, it's not innocent at the start. It uses the word festered
and rotted.
And rotted, But and then it becomes a
it's
little
that sort of foreshadowing that comes across on that, isn't there? Yeah.
Speaking of nature being dangerous, that'd be a nice segue, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Into hawk roosting.
Yeah. Another poet who I love, Ted Hughes, as well. I love a harsh nature poem. I love a harsh, because nature is cruel. Nature is harsh.
Didn't he write one about a crow as well?
Was
that Ted Hughes?
I think so.
I can't remember. Anyway, so hawk roosting is on the surface about a hawk who is sat at the top of a tree, and Ted Hughes, he's a Yorkshireman, isn't he? So he'd be used to sort of roaming the fields and the very sort of dales or whatever. And he sort of noticed a hawk, as you do, just sort of perched on the top of a tree. And he was thinking, I wonder what could be going through the hawk's head, what his thoughts and feelings might be if he were to personify that bird. And by all accounts, from his point of view, it's just about a bird at the top thinking, oh, I'd quite like to kill something, thank you very much, because, it needs to kill to eat. However, there have been multiple different readings of this.
Yeah, theories.
And I think that's why you always keep using that word tentative, that you can everyone's going to read a poem differently, and they're going to take different things from it. That doesn't necessarily mean that was fully the writer's intention. And you get into an interesting debate over ownership there, don't you?
Yeah, I think that's another thing
who
that's
owns the
important
meaning
about
of the
poems,
of the
isn't
poem?
it? Yeah,
is
who
it the
owns
author
it?
and their intention, or is it how people read it and how it's received by society? Does that then become the true meaning, whether the author meant it or not? I mean, for me, I can absolutely see how it can be a complete allegory for a despotic leader and all that sort of thing, but also at the same time, it's a hawk, and it just talks about how powerful it is and how nothing can top it, and I'm just going to kill whatever I want because I'm at the top of the food chain, and that's how a hawk operates, and if that's what Ted Hughes wants to say that it's about, then fair play. I think I think as well, if this came up, is what I want to say, is if this came up and it said about how nature is presented, you could touch on the potential allegorical meanings of it, but just take it as a hawk. It's and what Hughes said and how it presents that powerful nature. Sorry, Miss Dale.
No, don't sorry. You could also. I was gonna say something else, but it's interesting what you said. How nature is presented. Yeah, you can talk about it's a hawk and it's predator and it's the apex predator, top of the food chain, but you could also interpret the word of the question. And we're going to get on to getting high marks and how you get that. But actually, I think one of the best things that a really, really top-level student can do is to not be afraid of the question. So we were always taught this when I was at school, is to really focus on the question, what you're being asked, but also to attack the question itself. So if you get a question on nature, you can talk about human nature and you can talk about the nature of nature. So saying, I like a cruel nature poem. Nature is cruel. And what you said about Simon Armitage's quote about how it requires concentration, I think what you've got here, like you said, Mr. Owens, is you've got Ted Hughes just on his own in nature, especially in Yorkshire where it can be a bit bleak and there is a hawk all by itself, and he's just really concentrating. He's like, actually, what would its mindset be like? And he's taken the time to pen that down and to really get inside its head, like you say, and that's sort of personified. But you can also look at the nature of of life and how it is nasty and how we do tear things apart. So you could interpret the question of nature itself, or this is the nature of animals.
Yeah.
The nature of like the life cycle is to attack and eat and be eaten. And
Yeah. It is quite interesting because from a local point of view as well, there have been so many red kites that have been reintroduced to the area, and one of my year 11s was saying that he'd seen 4 of them having a fight.
Exactly.
Over, I think it was a bit of roadkill or something.
The allotment of death, as Hughes puts it.
And you know, I wonder what red kite roosting might sound like. Just on a more flippant note, it makes me think of my cat Piper, when she's got a little mouse in her mouth, and she's thinking, oh, do I kill it? Do I let it go? Or do I let my mum go and run around after it and try and keep it while it's still alive or not? It's that sort of arrogance, but it's nature, isn't it? It's not. I think if this was a person here, it would take on a much more sinister tone, wouldn't it? Because people think about violence, they think about overturning others, they think about dominating. Nature, that's it. It is just nature. That's what happens. There's no necessarily, I don't think, there's no thought behind it. And this is why I will always champion animals over people, because, animals can be violent, but that's instinct, isn't it? It's not, let's sit around and think of how many ways we can kill people and make them suffer.
And that's kind of what you get from the poem, really. The hawk doesn't seem to take any amusement in what he's saying or what she's saying.
It just is what it is.
It just is what it is, and you get that in these like declarative sentences, in these really sort of simple phrasings. The fact that everything it says is quite monosyllabic, it's very direct. I
kill where I please because it is all mine.
I am going to keep things like this. Like like you said, if it was a human, if this was Ozymandias, which by the way this poem compares beautifully to,
if you're looking at power as well.
it is quite sinister, but like you said, it's just that kind of I am what I am, take me as I am. I am 100% hawk.
I love that it took the whole of creation to produce my foot, my each feather.
The arrogance
I
of
hold
that.
creation in my foot.
Yeah.
I'm going to decide who lives and who dies. I'm going to decide. And for that, you can't help but think, is he having a dig at people with power? I don't know, because, does nature necessarily have those kind of thoughts?
One of my year 10s interpreted that as, does he think he's God?
Like God complex.
God-like, that I hold creation now in my foot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what's nice about poetry. You bring your own reading to it.
Shall we move on to another one, do we think?
Yeah, let's move on. So we've got the epic that is To Autumn, which we did expect Miss Ridgeon to come and talk about, because it is one of her favourite poems, but sadly, I think the quote was, I've got better things to do than hang around with you lot. No, I'm only joking. Don't worry, please don't sack me, miss. So, To Autumn then, who wants to take the lead on this?
I just think this poem, this man loves autumn, doesn't he?
Wow,
analysis done.
GCSE answer there from Mrs Steele.
Now let's do another poem.
John Keats really likes autumn.
Is it about his impending death?
My reading is yes. Miss Ridgeon has quite often debated me on this and said no, she thinks she's not here. So I'm just going to say that I don't see how. He's literally in the autumn of his life when he's writing this. He knows he's about to die, and he talks about gathering, that last line, that final line, gathering swallows twitter in the skies. It's like, yep, here we all are, we're gathering, we're ready, and my soul is about to migrate. I'm off. See you later.
I think you have to take into account that this is one of the romantics as well.
Yeah.
And when you
R.
with a capital R, guys, this is not as in I love this person, I feel romantically towards them. This is capital R. I revel in nature and the sublime, and I disdain authority and government and institution. And I think when you interpret, is it about his death? I think that when you consider where he's coming from as a romantic poet, yes, it probably is, because he would use a metaphor to compare it to the autumn of your life, because he's a romantic poet, and that's where your context comes in key as well. You can be tentative as you like, but you can make informed guesses. And if if you want those high marks, you do need to know which of the poets are the romantics, because there's quite a few of them in here, and the romantics do love a bit of nature. So yeah, I would agree with that.
I think it fits in well with the modern idea of mindfulness as well. That seeing beauty in the smallest of things.
Yes.
You know, looking at a little flower and just thinking, oh, little flower, you know, look at your little petals, and I wonder what created you, and really sort of focusing on the simple things and finding wonderment. So I suppose it's a bit like Death of a Naturalist in that sense,
Yeah, the
taking
wonder.
nature and finding the you know, the wonderment in the hazel shells or the little bees, you know, and sort of saying, you know, even though it might be coming to the end of summer and you know, autumn, and things are starting to ripen before they then die or get eaten or whatever.
I think it's nice to track the journey of the personified autumn across this poem. It's nice to sort of see it as, you know, it's almost a producer in the first stanza, then it's like industrial, it's a provider, it does the work, it assists the humans in the harvest, and then that sort of final, that death of autumn in the final stanza, and the sort of sadness associated with it slipping away into winter. I think that's a really sort of nice structural point to make onto autumn.
Yeah, you get this wonderful sort of the apples, the moss cottage trees as well, so it's, you know, it's a lovely sort of, you know, if you love nature, it's a real sort of indulgence in the smaller parts. And sort of, I mean, one of the things that I always notice about autumn is when the leaves come down, and I don't know if you do, but I love sort of running through the leaves, you know, even now sort of smashing through the leaves when they're all sort of
get your wellies on.
I do get my wellies on, and you know, it's fun, isn't it?
I thought you were going to go all Theresa May then, and I love running through the fields of wheat.
No, not fields of wheat. That's another one. No.
I think, and again, from an analytical perspective, you've tracked the structure, which is lovely. If you want some specifics, we were talking about the hawk before and the kind of harshness of the language. Look at the softness of the sounds here. You've got a lot of questions, which lends it a lilting quality. Where are the songs of spring? Where are they? But you've also got a lot of haspic sounds, so the H sound, which is very soft. You've got a lot of soft sibilant sounds. It's again, and you have to look from poem to poem to start picking up on this, guys. But if you were to flick back to Hawke and look at how hard and blunt and monosyllabic that is, and then you look at Autumn on the page, you can tell that it's softer and it's kind of sweeter, and it's got that kind of nostalgic, reminiscent. You can tell that purely from the reading out. Like summer has o'er brimmed. You've got longer vowel sounds. You've got, like I said, the sort of soft haspic kind of sounds in this.
I agree. That beautiful reminiscent. Where are the songs of spring? Like he's looking back for childhood and trying to think of that. And even the soft dying day. It's all very soft and gentle.
Just like autumn would be at the end of an autumn.
It's quite a sleepy poem.
It is a sleepy poem, yeah.
And again, you go back to that death metaphor, it feels like it could be that idea of the calmness associated with him slipping away and shuffling off this mortal coil.
I suppose if you know you're dying, or you have that sort of that sense, you might.
Is he making peace
things
with things?
Yeah, you might notice things a little more and try to slow time down by sort of noticing things individually rather than just rushing through the day. And we often, you don't notice anything, and sometimes it can be nice if you're just walking through the woods and you just see a little squirrel or something, just to sort of focus on and say hi to Mr. Squirrel.
Like Boris, who lives outside my classroom and pays me a visit every single morning.
He paid me a visit the other day.
Yes, Boris the squirrel who lives
I've got
in
Bob
the fields
the
outside.
Crow.
Bob the Crow, nice.
I love Bob the Crow. I've heard him a few times.
There is I do believe there is a pigeon called Nigel who lives around, and he is the largest pigeon I think I've ever seen. And there's Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe is a local legend who actually, sorry, Mrs Whittle, if you end up listening to this, one of my greatest memories is watching Russell the Crowe peck Mrs Whittle on the head in the car park of the commercial round the corner.
Right, well, let's move on to our sort of last main
prelude.
Good old prelude.
Yeah, thankfully it's just an excerpt. We're not dealing with.
How long would the exam be if it was dealing on the entire thing, do you think?
Move from chilly autumn to freezing winter.
Yeah, we've done that quite well actually. It's one of the better excerpts, I think, as well. Different anthologies give different excerpts from the prelude. This one's delightful.
I think just to point out at the start of this, everybody, when you are revising, make sure you are revising the correct excerpt from the prelude. Yeah. We do the Eduqas excerpt from the prelude, the one about ice skating, not the one about the huge peak, black and huge. If you see a huge peak, black and huge... Or a boat, lustily dipping his oars in the water... Yeah. Run away in the other direction.
This is where Mr. Bruff would jump in and say something inappropriate.
Well, it's only my first term, so I better not. I don't want to be fined.
It's a great excerpt, the other one from AQA, but it's not relevant to us. So no huge peaks, black and huge.
Yeah, paddling swiftly away from that.
Yes.
I don't think we're looking at adolescents. We're looking younger, aren't we?
And in the frosty season when the sun was set.
Yes.
And
straight away, I'm thinking sleigh bells. I'm thinking Christmas music. Yeah. I'm right there.
So cozy,
it's like one of those Christmas cards, isn't it? That you
frosty.
Get
is that word frosty?
Yeah, of people just sort of like ice skating on a lake, which is totally dangerous. So don't do that.
Well, that's just global warming.
I mean, you obviously don't have the childish abandon of William Wordsworth.
I mean, who does have the childish abandon of William Wordsworth?
Me, because I'm still very young.
Yeah, the absolute rapture.
I just see the danger and potential doom of
I'm still Wordsworth, you're already Heaney, that's it.
Yeah, I'm old Heaney. Thank you.
I just want to jump in on this one because... any of my Year 11 classes, Year 10 classes from years previously will always have this poem introduced to them. And this contains Mr. Steele's favourite line of poetry in the entire anthology. And then once we've read it, they're like, one of these is your favourite line. What is it?
Which
Did anyone want to guess what my favourite line is?
I'll guess.
It's actually, to be fair, it's not my favourite line. It's enjammed.
Is it 2 lines?
Is it enjammed? What's the verb?
Enjammed. Is it 2 lines?
It's across 2 lines.
Right, can we guess?
Yes, go on. This is very riveting reading for anyone.
Is it the alien sound of melancholy?
It's not the alien sound of melancholy because, as we all know, the sound of melancholy is not alien to me at all.
Especially not when we've had 2 days
darkness,
of
smile. Is it every icy crag tinkled like iron?
I do like that, but no.
Ooh. Yes, I had to describe what tinkling was.
Tinkle like...
How did you manage that, miss?
There's several meanings of the word tinkle.
Oh, is it the stars eastward were sparkling clear?
No, it's not.
And in the west, the orange sky of evening died away?
Nope.
Oh. I think you're going to have to put
I'm just going to have to put it at misery. It is, all shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice.
That is nice. And you have to read it out loud to get it.
Because of the sibilants.
We all shod with steel,
and it's like the greatest use of sibilants in the entire world.
Well,
like you can literally just hear the ice skates on the ice.
Can. We hissed along, that's great.
We hissed along the polished ice. It's there, they're ice skating in front of you. It's amazing.
It's that hissed bit is almost like when you're just stopping as you've turned a little bit and you're stopping and your skate sort of...
I was never that good on the ice.
No, this is my imagination.
This was my sound.
It might surprise you to know that when I then, with exactly the same amount of enthusiasm that I just did, all the children look at me and go, "You're so sad," and that's just my life.
Well, I think it's sad to not like things. I think it's good to like things.
Yeah. And I like with this again, you've got that free abandonment, haven't you, until sort of the end of it. And it fits in quite well with Death of a Naturalist.
This is a great one to compare.
Yeah, you've got that innocence to experience, haven't you? Mm-hmm. That sort of sense of, my mum's calling me in, but I'm going to pretend not to hear, and I'm going to carry on for as long as I can. And it might be that sort of sense, with the romantics, to try and make childhood last as long as you possibly can, because who wants to grow up? Who wants to be an adult?
Yeah, I've quite often tried to illustrate to my classes that sort of element of the sublime that creeps in at the end, and the precipice is ringing aloud, and sort of saying, because it's hard to explain when you haven't experienced.
Yeah, when you've not stood on top of a mountain in nature and felt overwhelmed, like, how do you link
going
to
to
Wordsworth?
Malham Cove and standing there looking out across, the rolling hills,
the vast horizons.
It's that sort of, wow, this is intensely beautiful, but also like if I take one step forward, I'm
a bit on the dead side.
Like, so that sort of almost fear but wonderment associated with this mass of nature that is impossible to understand.
And he taps into how kids get that, don't they? Like they'll be like you were just saying, Miss Owens, they'll just be charging along, going through some leaves or something, having the time of their lives, and then suddenly at some point they'll just have this moment of like, oh my god, I'm so tiny and the universe is so big, and it's that overwhelming.
When you're looking at the stars, isn't it?
It is, and he captures that. He I think William Wordsworth just somehow managed to retain his childlike wonder, didn't he?
Well, if you're living in the Lake District, I mean,
True.
wouldn't you?
Yeah, you would. Yeah. And if anybody's been there, that's a good way to experience the sublime. Think about all those massive mountains.
Yeah, and being stood in the areas where he trod and wrote quite a lot of his poetry it's great to understand, like, you know, what inspired him to write these poems.
We live louder lives now as well. I think all the romantics were probably very quiet for a lot of time. And I think if you go out by yourself into the woods or into nature, you'll get a slight taste of what they were trying to get across.
Yeah, definitely.
And I love here it says, so through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle.
Shod with steel as well, they're like knights in shining armour.
Yeah, that sort of sense. He's enjoying the din, he's enjoying the noise and the excitement and everything, and then suddenly you just kind of get this sense of, oh, it's not going to last forever. And the end bit for me, the orange sky of evening died away.
So sad.
You know, welcome to you know, the more serious bit of your life now. You know, you don't have that sort of childlike wonder.
Playtime's over.
Yeah, and I think this always reminds me of my niece and nephew when we go to Scarborough or something, and they just run towards the sea, and they're playing in the sea, and they don't have any care in the world, and there's me sort of going, please don't die, please, you know, just you know, watch for the waves, watch for any jellyfish, and it's that. Yeah, sharks. It's well-known sharks in Scarborough.
Oh yeah. Oh, I don't want to open that can of worms now, Mrs Pearson.
We could Sharknado. We could talk about some of the other dangers. We're not going to do that, but it's that sort of sense of, as an adult, you fear things that children just don't, and it.
Also, like, maybe that's considering the language in the poem is quite tough for our students. It's a shame almost, because they're at a time in their lives where this poem probably rings very true to them, actually, and that they are growing up and they are starting to realise, oh, I'm entering the adult world and I'm leaving behind childhood. So it's probably quite relatable for them in some ways if they can just get their heads around the language.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
I just think it's really interesting the way that all the nature poems focus on that idea of light and day and the winter and the season as stages of the life. You know, spring, you're born; summer, you grow up and flourish, and then going into old age, and then eventually wintry death.
I think I'm in the winter of my discontent at the moment. I feel like it. Yeah, and it's wonderful. It's nice how and you begin to see it as a collection, don't you? Like how these poems of
how they fit together,
how
they've influenced each other as well, especially the romantics.
And perhaps this is a nice way into our top tips for stretch and challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that my biggest one is to always consider that you shouldn't be writing as these poems as unseen. I quite often see deep language analysis and things like that is then not paired with any sort of contextual information.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, you can do the most fabulous unpicking of the words and sort of twisting it around and trying to work out what the poet intended, but you have been studying these poems for almost 2 years. Like, don't treat them like it's the first time it's been put in front of you. You know about the poet's life. You know about their influences. You know about why they were writing this poem.
Should.
Yeah, well, you absolutely should, yeah. So don't forget that. You know, you are not... You could do, as I've already said, you could do the most brilliant analysis and picking apart of words, but if you are not pairing it with that contextual analysis, it's a third of the marks. You are not going to get into the top grades. You have to cover all of the bases.
And I think that comes in with which quotes do you bother to learn? You know, we're not going to know everything. We don't know everything about every poem. And, you know, if you're going to learn a quote, to remember, think about what are you going to do with that. If you're just sort of sitting there going, well, I've learnt this quote, I don't know what I'm going to do with it, then it's useless. Make the quote work for you. So think about, again, some of those sounds in Heaney that you can just drop in. Think about, the hawk, sort of that idea of creation, and sort of the imagery that sort of comes with it, that arrogance that comes with it as well. So, don't just see quotes in isolation. Think about, is there imagery there?
Bigger
If
picture.
so, how does it tie into the whole representation of nature, as powerful or as destructive or as beautiful or as innocent? Know what it is that you're going to say about them as well.
So that would be my advice. Touching on what I was saying earlier, so Mr. Steele said, you've been doing these poems for 2 years, you know them really well. The place where you get to play and to show off and be tentative and exploratory is because you know the content so well, or you should. The place where you get to show off is your interpretation of the question and the way you craft your response. So because you know the text, they are expecting a much more crafted, high-level, nuanced, thoughtful response. So when I was saying earlier about, let's say the question was on nature, you should then be thinking, what are 3 different ways I can interpret the idea, the theme of nature? I know my quotes, I know my context for Wordsworth or whoever it is, but can I look at, the power of nature? That's one argument. But can I also look at human nature? That's another argument. Can I have a look at the way that nature affects us and link that to the romantics, because I've got a romantic poet? That's another argument. And it's about like a standard 9, a standard 8, 9 answer will have a very crafted, clear line of argument from the start. It has, you have to be confident from the start and have a clear introduction and a direction. You might have heard it called a thesis statement, you might have heard it called a line of argument. It doesn't really matter. It's about having a much more coherent approach, and that's the difference to unseen poetry. With the unseen poetry, they're going to be very forgiving. They're not going to expect the writer to be confident from the get-go. And usually what you see is that they get more confident as they go along.
I think the unseen poetry, it tends to be much more accessible as well, doesn't
absolutely.
it?
Yeah, it is. It's like it's a really
You're
obvious.
never going to get an equivalent of To Autumn as an unseen poem. Like,
Oh, goodness.
Exactly.
And they tell you what it's about, don't they, in the first line.
Whereas with this, they want you to have already done all that kind of tentative work beforehand, and to then be like, I'm really confident on this, and actually I'm going to sit here and think about the question in various different ways and really show off my argument style.
I think it's really important as well to plan.
Yes.
Do not start writing. If you plan your arguments, you get to think deeply about it. Then you can craft your thesis statement, and in your introduction, you must plan. And I think there's a huge correlation between the top marks and those that plan.
Yeah.
And a plan does not have to be a page of detail, anything.
Bullet points.
Plans for me in exams were literally little scribbly mind maps, but it gives you something to anchor yourself with.
Yeah.
And it allows you as well, if there's something else that you're thinking about and you're not quite there yet in your argument, you can just add it to your plan. You can tick bits off in your plan, so you've got that sort of sense of, yes, I've covered this, I've done this. It takes on a much more sort of fluent way of sort of guiding the reader through your argument, really.
Gives you that confidence as well, doesn't it? Because you know what you're going to write about, rather than flailing through a point and then getting lost.
Yeah, and then just thinking, I'm not really sure where this is going.
Yeah.
Which we've had, is there anything about comparing poems and selecting?
I think what you mentioned at the very start of this podcast was really key to remember when it comes to comparisons. Don't think just because you know as imperceptibly as Grief that you're just going to shoehorn that in because it's a high level poem or it's a difficult poem. Go for the obvious ones and formulate those arguments. If you're presented with Valentine, it's going to be quite clearly easy. I know this is a love poem, obviously, but it's going to be very easy to compare that with Sonnet 43 or, Cosy Apologia. Pick the obvious comparisons and then just pair up ideas. Take some time to sit down and be like, right, well, both of these poems do this, both of these poems do this. This one's got more of this sort of vibe, or, think about your ideas and your arguments with your comparisons.
So what I find helpful with that, I've started doing this for my year 11s, is you'll get two really obvious poems side by side. So let's say it's excerpt from the Prelude and Death of a Naturalist. And what's really nice is to get like 4 different coloured highlighters and to very mindfully match up the right quotes. Really look for what both okay, where's the turning point in Death of a Naturalist, right? I'm going to look at like mud grenades or whatever you want to look at. Where's the turning point in excerpt from the Prelude? So you've got maybe like 4 matched quotes that argue the same things. The techniques can be different. That's not the point. For high level, like a lower level comparison answer will go, this one uses alliteration and this one uses alliteration, and they both use alliteration. It's like, well, yeah, a high-level comparison will be like, this one has this idea and they use alliteration to express it. This one also has this idea and they express it in a totally different way.
Yeah.
The sound, the alliteration, it might be more aggressive in one, it might be softer in the other.
It might not be alliteration at all, though. That's the point. Like,
I think you actually raise a point which not really linked to high levels and things like that, but it's the most basic levels in that you need to lead with ideas and meanings rather than techniques. Like Miss Dales, when she just said this poem uses alliteration and this poem also uses alliteration. Yeah, well done. You've just picked up maybe 1 mark. Yeah. You know, I don't care that they both use alliteration. I care what that alliteration might suggest. Yeah. You know, I need you to lead with those meanings and ideas.
Whereas if you lead with the idea of both poets deal with a sense of loss of innocence with through nature, that's leading with an idea, and then you can back it up with a volta from one poem and a piece of imagery from another. It doesn't really matter.
So that idea of like both suggest a dangerous side to nature, or one suggests that perhaps we become, you know, nature can be more vulnerable than the other, or, you know,
and again that links to your planning.
Those concepts.
Planning also helps you to compare both poems in each paragraph, because analysing just one poem and then the other is not going to get you the marks.
No, they want to be together, don't they?
They need to be, this poem, then this poem.
And then don't...
Like tennis.
Yeah, ping pong,
Ping pong. Yeah, and don't wait until the exam to do that. Start planning now, start looking at, you know, write that overall sentence, you know, start thinking about your topic sentences, what ideas are similar or different in the poems, and come back to the poet's intention as well, and their contexts as well. You know, how are they similar? How are they different?
I think that's what for year 10, who again I'll shout out to my year 10s who were just, you know, they've absolutely been troopers through the poetry. They've been fantastic with their note making, and we're kind of front loading all that on you now to get through the sort of trudgy, dulce et decorumus trudging through work, but come back to it
in year... Not going to get PTSD from it,
Well, they might. But coming back to it in year 11, that's when we'll start thinking about it. But there's nothing to stop you with, because some of them are really meticulous with their notes, there's nothing to stop you making loads of notes now and starting to think through those themes in more depth.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Right, so just a couple of things just to end. So first of all, it's Miss Dales' birthday today, so we're going to say happy birthday to Miss Dales, and she's not 21 again.
I'm not a day over 25. Let's
just
go with that.
Another year closer to retirement. What we'll go with.
I thought you were going to say another year closer to death. That's looking very bleak,
dark.
very sort of
Very
swiftly approaching the autumn of my life.
I can see some gathering swallows gathering around Miss Dales' head.
Flying around my head.
And this week's word of the week is Fobbly Mobbly. We love that. I just love the sound of that. We'll talk about sounds.
Are we counting it as one word even though it's hyphenated?
Yeah, it's a hyphenated word. It's a compound word.
It's hyphenated, so it's a compound word. And it's 18th century, and it means that, do you know what, you're neither well nor unwell, it's just a little bit meh.
So we've have Ofsted this week. How are we all feeling?
Yeah,
we're all
probably
feeling
Probably mobbly. Right, okay, so thank you all for listening, and next week we will be talking through the war poems.
Woo!
The anthology.
It just gets better.
I think Miss Owens just decided that 10 seconds ago.
No, totally planned. Totally planned.
Yeah, that'd be great. I love talking about some
war. I love a
war.
good war poem.
I love a good war poem. All right, calm down, Vlad, on the other end of the table. And on that note, with Miss Dales is not a war criminal, let's just end the podcast there. See you later, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.